Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes. Did you recognize the quote? Then you have come to the right place, because the story you're about to hear is as nerdy as it is remembering the wording of the Apple TV commercial back from 1997. You did not recognize it. Don't worry. As long as you have a thing for old computers, the 70s, totally crazy ideas, or all three of those, take my word for it, this should be fun. The whole story began last November, when I stumbled upon the offer of a Kim-1 computer on eBay. In case you don't know, the Kim-1 had been a developer board to showcase the new 6502 processor done by MOS Technology. Former Motorola employee Chuck Peddle led the designing of this chip, which in the following years has been used in many 8-bit home computers, including the Atari 8-bit computers, the Commodore VIC-20, and of course the Commodore 64, the Apple-1 and Apple-2, and many more. But the story of the 6502 is a different one, and shall be told at a different time. Back to the Kim-1. Because I like the white PCB version of the Kim-1 very much, I mean, it does look really cool, doesn't it? I went ahead and bought it for about $1,500. When it arrived a few weeks later in December, I was amazed in what great and working condition it was. When it came out in 1976, you bought it as it is, just PCB, no power supply, not even a case to protect the circuit. So I had the idea to design an acrylic case for it, which looked like this in the end. And I thought, well, that does not look too shabby, does it? So I had a small run of the cases produced and offered them on eBay, in case any other retro computer fan would want one for their Kim-1 too. To my surprise, it did not take very long, and I'd sold all 10 cases that I have had produced. And if you wonder by now what this has to do with the Apple-1 and its manuals, we are getting there, I promise. Because one of the buyers of the Kim-1 case asked me whether I offered a similar case for the Apple-1 too. Well, I did not at that time, but I told him I would look into the measurements and came back to him once I managed to adapt the case to fit the Apple-1 board. Little did I know that there are several replicas of the original Apple-1 PCB available, and all of them are slightly different when it comes to the exact position of the mounting holes, and I used those mounting holes to attach the acrylic case. It turned out that the very client had a replica board made from open source Gerber files, which are used by PCB manufacturers to produce the PCBs. This came in handy because I could get the measurements I needed from those files very precisely. And finally, we are closing in on the main story, because during my research of the Apple-1 and its different replica boards, I also came across some pictures of the Apple-1 operation manual and learned not only that the original sells for $10,000 to $20,000 at auctions, but that cheap laser printed copies of scans are sold on eBay for up to $100. Laser printed copies on cheap paper for $100. The nerve of it! And I thought, well, that doesn't do this iconic computer any justice at all. So I got my hands on those scans, which can be found online, retouched them, and had them printed by a professional printing company in order to enhance the quality. And when I got them back, I was really excited at first, but after inspecting them properly, I thought, this isn't any good either. And it was absolutely nowhere where I thought a proper replica should be. Sure, it had been saddle stitched and nice paper and all of that, But the format was wrong. It was European DIN A4 instead of the original US letter format. The fonts were super pixelated because of the bad resolution of the scans. And most importantly, the fold-out section with the schematics had been completely absent. And then it hit me. What if I retypesetted the manuals from scratch, recreating the manuals using a modern DTP application like Adobe InDesign, and used the scans just to make sure that the replica would be congruent to the original? And I knew immediately this would be the king's way, and if successful, would open the possibility to create some really, really awesome results. Boy, if I had known back then what kind of mission I was about to engage, I would have never ever touched that with a 10-foot pole. But instead, I wondered, how would I even start? Sure, I had the scans of all the pages. So as a very first step, I placed the scans as a background layer in the InDesign document. But typing the first words of the manual, it dawned on me. I had no clue what typeface had been used back in 1976. I mean, I was 6 years back then and could not even write myself. So I was about to find out that identifying typefaces from 45 years ago was far more easier said than done. I compared the scans with hundreds and hundreds of different fonts. And while some of the typefaces I found featured similar characters compared to the one in the manual, the difference was too much to be acceptable. And the reason why the correct typeface was so hard to find, the manual had been probably typed on an IBM electric typewriter and not a typesetting machine. And because of that, the chances that somebody recreated a typewriter's typeface as a modern font was rather slim. So before it really started, the whole project was in jeopardy. And seeing my chances fading of finding somebody that maybe recreated that typewriter typeface for the digital age, I was about to give up. In a last effort, I called for help in the specialized forum of typography.guru and was lucky enough to be pushed in the right direction by user Kevin Thompson, who found a font called F21 Executive to be very, very close. Now, just retyping the manual's content using the same typeface would have been a fairly easy job, but what I wanted was a super true to the original recreation, which means each and every character had to be positioned at exactly its correct place. And that's where the scans came into play, which I placed in a separate layer as my guide for correct line spacing and kerning of the characters. It is a bit difficult to describe how painful this job is, so let's watch a clip that demonstrates the process. You can see me there adjusting the position of each character by changing the kerning between each of the letters, character by character, paragraph by paragraph, page by page. This took ages. Again, if I had known before what kind of horrible, tedious job I had subscribed to, I would have thrown in the towel that very second. But by the time I realized that I must have lost my marbles, obviously, it was too late. What's more, every time I thought, sorry, I can't go on anymore, I'm getting mad, I envisioned the finished product in my hand, and that kept me going on for more than 100 hours. Once I was finished with the copy, I had a look at the schematics, and if you just thought, oh my god, those two? Yes, those two. Back in 1976, the schematics had been drawn by Ronald G. Wayne, who not only created the very first Apple logo, but also had been the third founder of Apple, a fact not too well known to the public, because Ron gave back his 10% stake in Apple just 12 days after Apple had been founded on April 1st, 1976. Again, this is another story, but here is the plot in a nutshell. Ronald had been brought on board to be the adult in the room. He was in his 40s, where Steve and Woz were in their 20s and arguing all the time. Ron was expected to tip the scales if necessary when the other two were unable to find common grounds. Ron also designed the operation manual, including the first Apple logo, and, now we are finally back on track, the schematics, which have been hand-drawn. Probably Ron used some sort of Leroy set. This also means that Ron drew each single letter from all the labels on the schematics by hand. So identifying digital recreations of typefaces became once again quite a challenge. But finally, about 8 weeks after the initial idea and after more than 130 hours of work, the redesigns were ready to go to the printers. And this is where the story could have ended. And then I saw this picture. And I knew immediately that before my mission was truly accomplished, there is one more thing. Did you know that it had been the plan of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak to sell the Apple-1 bare naked, just the unpopulated board? But Paul Terrell, founder and owner of the Byte Shop, could not be bothered selling yet another kit people had to solder together themselves. Instead, he made Steve and Woz the following offer. If you can complete 50 boards within 30 days, I order 50 of them at a price of $500 each to be paid in cash on delivery. So when Steve and Woz delivered the computers to Paul, at least one of the Byte Shop shops, the Byte Shop 3, stamped the Apple manuals with the Byte Shop stamp. I looked in the picture and I could not help it. The thorn was there. If these replicas were really to be as close to the original as humanly possible, I needed to replicate the stamp too. Which is a wonderful segue to a question you might have asked yourself by now. Wouldn't Apple sue the living crap out of somebody that recreated their copyrighted material without any permission? Probably. But the Apple manuals, the Apple-1 manuals, have never been copyrighted in the first place. Without going into too much detail, US copyright law states that everything published before 1977 that does not feature a proper copyright notice belongs into the public domain. Whether Steve and Woz simply forgot to put one on, or if it had been left out intentionally, I don't know. Neither did I know whether that law applied to company logo stamps too. What I knew, though, I would only be on the safe side if I simply had the official permission to recreate the stamp, which meant I had to track down the former owner of the Byte Shop, Paul Terrell. Surprisingly, it did not take too long of an online research to come up with a promising email address. In my message to Paul, I tried to explain the whole story without appearing too loopy, which is quite a task when you have to admit that most of the work you did was pushing single characters into their rightful position in a manual from more than 45 years ago. I mean, geez. But just 24 hours later, the following email appeared in my inbox. Armin, absolutely, you have my permission to replicate the Byte Shop logo stamp, but more importantly, I'm trying to figure out how I could replicate the actual event by giving you a cash-on-delivery purchase order for 50 of your Apple computers for $500 each just like the original seed capital event that occurred in 1976 and caused Steve Jobs to quit his job at Atari and was to quit his job at Hewlett-Packard to form Apple. Woz told me that it was that $25,000 cash-on-delivery purchase order that convinced him to take his hobby computer serious and quit HP to spend full time on his new company with his friend Steve Jobs. Thanks for the pics. Nice job, Paul. I just cannot comprehend how this could have turned out any better. Paul not only granted permission to recreate the stamp, he also shared a piece of computer history with me. In my book, there is no doubt that this very order of the first 50 Apple-1 computers from Paul Terrell changed the world forever. And I still struggle to imagine what the world would look like today if Paul had not been in the shop that day. Just 2 days later, I had a proper cut stamp in my hands together with a red ink pad. Isn't online shopping a beauty? So here comes the final result. The operation manual featuring the Byte Shop logo stamp, including the fold-out schematics, of course, the preliminary basic user's manual, and the cassette interface manual. Kind of as a bonus, I've also recreated the very first full-page ad that appeared in Interface Age in September or October 1976. So I thought the finished replicas looked really nice and that all the work and the result would be good enough to share them with others. So I reached out to many retro computer websites, boards, and Facebook groups to tell the tale, and the feedback was just amazing. I got invited to web shows and podcasts and interviews to talk about the recreations, and even a few magazines picked up on the story. Well, of course, I had hoped that there would be some people interested in the project, or at least would pity me for what I did, but I did not expect this. And the feedback made me think, because when a few people pointed out, that thing belongs in a museum, I said to myself, wait a minute, I happen to live in Munich, Germany, home of the Deutsches Museum, the world's largest museum of science and technology. And I knew that they exhibit an Apple-1 in their computer collection. So, naturally, I wrote an email to the curator of the microcomputer department and told her my little story. Again, hoping that I would not be seen completely loopy, and I sent along some pictures. Well, to cut a long story short, I really would like to show you the outcome. And I hope you forgive me when I tell you how incredibly proud I was when I found out what happened. And meanwhile, a few other museums around the world have happily accepted my donations and will add the manual replicas to their collections too, and I feel so honored. If you are interested in your own set of the Apple-1 manuals, head over to apple1manuals.com, and there you can not only buy the replicas of the manuals, you can also buy the Apple-1 PCB replica, a matching acrylic case, and a few more things related to Apple-1. Well, that's it. But before we wrap it up, there is one more thing. Today, 10 years ago, on October 5th, 2011, Steve Jobs moved on, and I would like to close this video with a little homage to the man that in my book influenced the history of computer like no one else. It's a remake of the Think Different TV campaign that aired in 1997, and I do hope you enjoy.
Here is to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who saw things differently. They were not fond of rules, and they had no respect for the status quo. You could have quoted them, disagreed with them, glorified or vilified them, but the only thing you could not do was ignore them. Because they've changed things, they've pushed the human race forward. While some saw them as the crazy ones, we saw genius. Because the people who were crazy enough to think that they can change the world are the ones who did.